All right, welcome back to our solutions and molarity video. Let's move on to our next topic. And so our next topic is dilution. And so dilution means a similar thing in chemistry to what it means in common language. It means that we're going to add more of our solvent to decrease the concentration of the solution. And so they give the example here of orange juice concentrate. We're going to add a bunch of solvent, in this case water, and it's usually going to be water in most situations we'll encounter. And we're going to end up with a solution of lower concentration. So you will be asked to do some calculations around this, but thankfully we have a nice simple equation for doing so. And this equation right here is known as our dilution equation. And it states that our starting concentration times our starting volume equals our final concentration times our final volume. And so we can actually use any units of concentration and volume that we wish, so long as the concentration units are consistent with each other. So C1 and C2 must have the same units, and V1 and V2 must also have the same units. But again, we can use whatever units we want of concentration or volume, as long as they match each other. So our question asks, what volume of 2% HCl solution can be prepared by diluting 25 milliliters of a 14% HCl solution? So we're asked what our new volume essentially, so we're going to have to solve for V2 and we're going to rearrange our equation. And if you don't remember how to rearrange equations, well, you're going to have to figure it out for the exam for sure. So I would suggest visiting the Learning Support Center. Any of the math tutors will be able to help you rearrange an equation like this. If they can't help you, let me know, and I'll I'll give them a stern talking to, because they should be able to help you with math like this. So we're going to rearrange our equation to solve for V2, and we're going to plug in our values. So our starting volume is going to be, there's our V1, that's the volume we're going to begin with, and our starting concentration is right there. And here's our new concentration we're going to create, that's going to be C2, and it's our V2 that we want to solve for here. And when we crunch all our numbers, we end up with 175 milliliters being our new volume. So I'd like you to now pause the video and please complete question number 5. Alright, welcome back everyone. So I have some fantastic news. You are almost finished. We have just one more topic left to talk about, and that's our like dissolves like rule. And so like dissolves like is a rule that talks about what sorts of things are going to mix together. And so what it states is that if we have a polar solvent, and water is our prime example you'll see most frequently, we are going to be able to dissolve polar solutes and ionic solutes. So polar solvents, like water, can dissolve polar solvents, polar solutes and ionic solutes. And so nonpolar solvents are going to dissolve nonpolar things, such as grease or oil. And a really common example of a nonpolar solvent is hexane. But really almost anything made of carbon and hydrogen is going to be a nonpolar solvent. And so you might be wondering, well, what if we try and mix polar things with nonpolar things? Well, they don't mix. And so some examples of this, you've probably heard the expression before, like oil and water, talking about things that don't mix. It's because oil and water aren't soluble in each other. The water is polar, the oil is nonpolar, therefore they don't mix. And then similarly, if we take like oil and vinegar, like a vinaigrette salad dressing, we can't make them dissolve in each other. We can shake up that salad dressing, but they'll separate over time. So here's a picture showing our like dissolves like rule. And so in our test tube to the left right here, we've mixed together water with a nonpolar solvent, which is called methylene chloride. So water and a nonpolar solvent. And what we see is they don't dissolve. We form two separate layers, just like if we mix oil and water or like oil and vinegar together. Now, if we add something nonpolar, I2 molecules are nonpolar, what we see is the I2 is going to dissolve into the nonpolar layer right here. How can we tell? Well, the color. This I2 has this kind of purple color, and we can see that it is basically almost entirely dissolved in the nonpolar layer, and we have little to none that's dissolved in our water right there, because the water is still almost colorless. And over here we have another example. We take our nickel nitrate, and this is ionic, so it's sort of like the extreme of being polar, it's super duper polar. We mix that together, and that's going to dissolve into our into our polar layer, into our water layer, and it's not going to dissolve into the nonpolar layer. So why should you care about this? Well, this is actually really important for biology because, like, you might have heard of fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins. So the ones that are fat-soluble, they can collect in your fats. You can overdose on them, and so they'd be like similar to I2. They're nonpolar, and our fat in our body is nonpolar, so that's where they're going to dissolve. And then our polar vitamins, our water-soluble vitamins, they can dissolve in our blood, and therefore our kidneys can filter them out. So they're hard to overdose on. And a lot of medications fit this description as well. Some medications will be able to dissolve into our blood and other sort of water-based materials in our body, while other drugs just don't dissolve very well into water, so they're going to dissolve into like our fats and tissues like that. So important to biochemistry. So here we have a question right here. Which of the following solutes will dissolve in water? Why or why not? And I liked this comic that I found right here. So the polar bear is yelling, "Help, I'm dissolving!" And the dark-colored bear says, "But bears are insoluble in water." And the bear is drowning, says, "That's easy for you to say. You're not polar." So what does this remind us of? Well, water is polar, and therefore polar things dissolve. And so let's take a look at our list here and figure out what's going to dissolve. So our first one here is going to be um, our sodium sulfate. And so this is an ionic compound, which is like super duper polar. So this one will indeed dissolve because it's superpolar and water's polar. Then we have gasoline. So gasoline will not dissolve, and it specifies here that gasoline's nonpolar. But you might not be aware of this. If you ever spilled gasoline onto water, it just kind of floats on the surface. It doesn't dissolve. I2 is also nonpolar, therefore it is not going to dissolve. And then finally we have HCl. So this molecule is polar. Hydrogen and chlorine are quite different from each other in electronegativity, and therefore it's polar and it will dissolve. So let's see how we did here. Bam! It looks like we've done well. So we got this stuff 100% right. We are now like dissolves like in polarity geniuses. Geniusi? Oh geez, maybe I'm not a genius after all. So anywho, please pause the video or end the video rather. We're done here, and complete questions 6 and 7. Thanks for sticking through. Bye.